Yes, left-handed people are absolutely as smart as right-handed people. The scientific evidence on this is remarkably clear, and I'll explain why claims to the contrary don't hold up. Let's start with what the research actually shows. Large-scale studies looking at hundreds of thousands of people find no meaningful difference in cognitive ability between left-handers and right-handers. A major 2019 analysis published in Brain and Behavior examined over 400,000 individuals and found the average IQ scores were essentially identical. When you have sample sizes that large and the needle doesn't move, that's a strong signal that handedness simply isn't a factor in general intelligence. Now, you might have heard scattered claims about left-handers being overrepresented among geniuses, or conversely, having higher rates of learning difficulties. Both of these claims suffer from the same problem: small samples, cherry-picked data, and a failure to account for confounding variables. When researchers control for things like socioeconomic background, education access, and measurement bias, the supposed differences evaporate. Here's an important point, often missed in this debate. Handedness is largely about motor control and how the brain organizes movement, not about how it processes abstract reasoning or stores knowledge. The idea that which hand you write with would determine your intellectual capacity is about as scientifically grounded as phrenology, that old pseudoscience of reading skull bumps. Left-handers make up roughly 10% of the population. They're architects, surgeons, mathematicians, artists, and everything else. The distribution of talent and intelligence among them mirrors the general population because handedness just isn't the variable people sometimes imagine it to be. I'm curious to hear what the opposing view could possibly offer here. What's the counter-argument?
Let me push back here, because the picture is not as tidy as my colleague just painted it. First, that 2019 study showing essentially identical averages can hide real differences. Nobody seriously claims left-handers are uniformly less intelligent. The actual finding in the literature is more nuanced. Left-handers show greater variance in cognitive outcomes. That means more at the extremes, both high and low. A 2010 study by Crow and others, and repeated findings in educational data from the UK and Australia, show left-handers are modestly overrepresented among those with learning disabilities, developmental delays, and lower standardized test scores. If the distribution is wider and slightly shifted, saying everyone is just as smart is technically misleading, even if the means are close. Second, dismissing the mechanism as just motor control is hand-waving away decades of neuroscience. Handedness correlates with patterns of brain lateralization, how functions are distributed across hemispheres. Left-handers are far more likely to have atypical lateralization of language, and language lateralization is directly linked to verbal reasoning scores. A 2019 study in Brain, a different journal than the one cited using nearly 400,000 UK Biobank participants, found that left-handedness was associated with distinct brain architecture, including differences in white matter tracts connecting regions involved in higher cognition. That's not phrenology. That's tractography showing physical wiring differences. Third, the control for socioeconomic status and differences vanish. Argument actually works against the claim of equality. If you have to statistically remove real-world conditions to make the scores equal, then, in the actual world as people live in it, the differences exist. That's like saying, if you remove gravity, everyone jumps the same height. The question was whether left-handers are as smart, not whether they would be in some idealized scenario. The honest answer is no. Not because left-handedness causes stupidity, but because it correlates with a broader distribution of cognitive outcomes and, in population-level data, a slight but real disadvantage on average in verbal and scholastic measures. Slight doesn't mean zero, and essentially identical is doing a lot of heavy lifting to paper over what the data actually show.
The previous speaker is making a classic statistical sleight of hand, conflating variance with average ability, and then using slight but real disadvantage language that contradicts the actual data. Let's be direct about the numbers. When that UK Biobank study with 400,000 people is cited, the effect sizes for any cognitive differences by handedness are tiny, We're talking fractions of a standard deviation. At that scale, statistical significance and practical significance are completely different things. Something can be real and detectable in 400,000 people while being completely irrelevant in any individual assessment. That's not a technicality, that's how data works. On the variance argument, yes, left-handers may show slightly wider spread in outcomes. But the top end of that variance includes overrepresentation among mathematicians, architects, musicians, and yes, several presidents. If the distribution spreads both directions, you can't selectively cite the lower tail as evidence that left-handers are less smart. That's cherry-picking half a distribution. The brain architecture point is genuinely interesting science, but it proves too much. Different wiring doesn't mean worse wiring. Left-handers have atypical language lateralization, meaning their brains organize language differently, not defectively. You wouldn't say someone who drives a different route to work is a worse driver. The bottom line is this: the best large-scale evidence shows essentially equivalent average intelligence. The variance differences exist but are symmetric. The brain differences are real but don't translate to lower ability. Left-handed people are, by every meaningful measure, just as smart.
That sounds tidy, but it dodges the actual question. As smart is not the same as the average score in one giant dataset is almost the same. If one group is consistently a bit more likely to struggle in language, reading, school performance, and some learning measures, then saying the groups are simply just as smart is too blunt to be true. The mean is a useful summary, but it can absolutely hide meaningful differences in how outcomes are distributed across real people. And the symmetric variance reply is weaker than it sounds. Even if a distribution is wider on both ends, that still means handedness is associated with cognitive outcomes in a real way. You don't get to say same intelligence after admitting one group is more spread out and more represented in difficulty categories. That is already a measurable difference. More important, the romantic examples, presidents, musicians, architects, are not evidence. They're anecdotes. The relevant evidence is the repeated finding that left-handedness is modestly overrepresented in some learning disability and lower achievement groups. That matters far more than cherry-picked famous left-handers. The brain organization point is also being softened beyond what the evidence supports. Different wiring does not automatically mean worse, true, but in this case the differences are not random decoration. Researchers have repeatedly looked at atypical lateralization, language networks, and white matter organization precisely because those differences sometimes track verbal and developmental outcomes. If a trait is linked even modestly to higher rates of certain cognitive or academic difficulties, then it is not enough to wave that away as just a different route to work. Sometimes a different route is slower. So the clean answer is no. Not because left-handed people are dramatically less intelligent across the board, and not because every left-hander is at a disadvantage, but because the evidence does not support strict equivalence. The best reading of the literature is, average gaps may be small, but the distributions are not the same, and the left-handed distribution includes a modestly higher burden of lower-end cognitive and scholastic outcomes. That is a real difference, and it means just as smart overstates the case.
Let me push back directly on the framing that's being smuggled in here. The claim that just as smart overstates the case only works if you treat statistical noise and tiny effect sizes as meaningful cognitive differences. They're not. First, let's talk about what these modestly overrepresented findings actually look like in numbers. We're talking about studies where left-handers might be 12% of a learning difficulty group instead of 10% of the general population. That's the scale of difference being presented as evidence that left-handers aren't as smart. Meanwhile, the actual cognitive assessments, IQ tests, reasoning measures, problem-solving tasks show gaps so small they disappear into measurement error. The UK Biobank data we've discussed involves hundreds of thousands of people, and the effect sizes are fractions of a standard deviation. That's not hiding a meaningful difference. That's confirming there isn't one worth discussing. Second, the variance argument is being deployed selectively. Yes, some studies suggest left-handers show slightly more spread in their scores, but increased variance in both directions is not evidence of being less intelligent. It's evidence of being more variable. If I said, men show greater variance in height than women, nobody would conclude men are shorter. The logic doesn't follow. And critically, when researchers control properly for socioeconomic status, education quality, and the subtle ways left-handers were historically treated as deficient in school systems, much of that apparent variance shrinks or vanishes. Third, the learning difficulty correlation deserves scrutiny, not acceptance. Correlation between handedness and certain developmental patterns could reflect shared underlying neurodevelopmental factors without implying any causal relationship where being left-handed makes someone less capable. We know, for instance, that forced hand switching, which was common in older generations, created documented learning problems. Are we sure these studies fully separate biological handedness from the cultural trauma historically inflicted on left-handers? The honest answer to are left-handed people as smart as right-handed people is yes. Tiny statistical wobbles in massive datasets don't change that practical reality.
The height analogy actually undermines your case. If someone asked, are men as tall as women? The answer is no, even though the distributions overlap enormously and most individual men and women fall in similar ranges. A consistent, replicable difference matters even when it's small. You're conflating, practically indistinguishable for any given individual, with no real difference exists. Those are different claims. On the 12 versus 10% point, you keep framing that as trivial, but a 20% relative increase in risk is not nothing. If left-handers are 20% more likely to appear in learning difficulty populations, that's the kind of signal epidemiologists take seriously in other contexts. Nobody dismisses a 20% elevated risk of a health outcome as statistical noise. The reason it looks small in absolute terms is that learning difficulties themselves are relatively uncommon, but the elevated rate is consistent and shows up across multiple independent cohorts. On confounding from forced switching, that's a fair historical point, but it cuts the wrong way for your argument. Modern cohorts where forced switching is rare still show these associations, albeit sometimes attenuated. If anything, the persistence of modest overrepresentation in contemporary samples, where cultural bias against left-handedness has largely disappeared, strengthens the case that something biological is going on rather than just historical mistreatment. The question isn't whether left-handers are dramatically less intelligent. Nobody is claiming that. The question is whether as smart is strictly accurate given consistent distributional differences. And the evidence says it's a simplification that glosses over real, replicable patterns in cognitive variability and developmental risk.
The height analogy actually helps my case more than yours. When we ask, are men as tall as women, the answer is no because the mean difference is about 5 inches. That's roughly half a standard deviation, which is enormous and immediately visible in everyday life. The cognitive mean difference between left and right-handers is a fraction of a standard deviation, closer to 1/10 or less. That's not the same kind of difference. You're using the structure of the analogy while quietly swapping in numbers that are 10 times smaller. On the 20% elevated risk, let's be precise about what we're actually talking about. If roughly 12% of a learning difficulty group is left-handed versus 10% in the general population, that means for any given left-handed person, the overwhelming probability is that they have no learning difficulty whatsoever. The absolute risk increase is tiny. Epidemiologists do care about relative risks, but they also demand biological plausibility, dose-response patterns, and effect sizes large enough to inform individual-level decisions. A 2 percentage point absolute difference, in one tail of one outcome, across studies with known methodological variation, does not clear that bar for concluding left-handers are cognitively different in any meaningful sense. The real question is what the phrase, as smart, means in plain English. It means, if you pick a left-handed person and a right-handed person at random, their expected intelligence is the same. That is what the data shows. The mean is the same. The practical predictive value of handedness for any individual's cognitive ability is essentially 0. Pointing to slight distributional shifts at the tails doesn't change what the average person experiences, and it doesn't change what an employer, teacher, or policymaker should conclude about left-handed people as a group.